I'd like to welcome you to the first in what will be a series of videos produced by the History Company about the Southeast Veterans Museum. My name is Louis Varnell. I'm the owner and founder of the business and the museum, and what we have sought to do is to collect stories to tell about those who have gone before and have served in the American Armed Forces. We're going to start by talking about Chickamauga Battlefield, because we are located nearby. It seemed like a natural place to begin. The battle itself is in September of 1863. Camp Thomas, Camp Greenleaf, and the 3rd WAC Training Center, however, also end up occupying that ground. That is something most people aren't aware of. When they come to the battlefield today, they see it as only a Civil War battle site. But in reality, the United States Army utilized that ground for quite some time to train soldiers to defend America in other wars. Most people are aware of the role of Chickamauga Battlefield during the American Civil War. In September of 1863, Union and Confederate forces clash on those fields. It is the second bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. As the years passed, the veterans returned. In the 1890s, they came together to begin marking new unit positions. And then in 1895, the park is formally dedicated. It is under the control of the Department of the Army. Very shortly thereafter, the United States finds itself in a war with Spain when the battleship Maine is blown up in Havana Harbor. And so the Army is now called upon to expand to large numbers, more than they have had since the American Civil War. And they have to find somewhere to train all of these troops. One of the areas that they choose is Chickamauga Battlefield. The park is converted into Camp George H. Thomas, named, of course, for the Rock of Chickamauga, who fights there in September of '63. The first troops who come to Camp Thomas are the American Regulars. As their regiments are assembled from out west, they are brought to Camp Thomas to get them equipped and get all of their units brought back together where they have been scattered across the frontier. They are then entrained to go to Tampa, Florida, where many of them do go overseas and fight in Cuba and the Philippine Islands and Puerto Rico. Now, after that first wave of regulars comes the volunteer troops. This was an opportunity, of course, for the sons of Civil War veterans to get their chance to see the elephant. And many of them are sent to Camp George H. Thomas, battlefields that their relatives might have actually fought upon, to begin training. At one point, 70,000 men were training at Camp Thomas. Now, we have a few artifacts in the museum from those men, one of which is this canteen from John Gamble of the 6th Tennessee. Another Tennessee regiment trained here as well, the 3rd Tennessee was here. We had units from Vermont, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, so a lot of the units that had fought here during the Civil War, their lineal descendants were now here again. This is a trapdoor Springfield bayonet. This was actually recovered in the area. Someone brought this in one day. They'd been cutting down a tree, and this was in the crook of a tree and probably sat there since 1898. Probably one of the more unique pieces to come in. Again, a Camp Thomas artifact. These are the remains of a trapdoor Springfield, the weapon used primarily by the volunteer troops here. And, of course, some soldier, for losing his rifle, I'm sure had to pay a very stiff fine. Camp Thomas has the dubious distinction of having the highest casualty rates outside of active combat operations in Cuba due to a typhoid epidemic that sweeps through the camp in the summer of '98. The area in front of Wilder Tower was used as a division hospital, and many men went there and did not return to their units. The National Cemetery in Chattanooga is full of men who die in July, August, September of '98 from typhoid. The decision is made to break up the camp, and so these men are sent to other areas. Members of the 3rd Tennessee go to Anniston, Alabama, where they are mustered out of service because the war has ended so quickly. The majority of men who train at Camp Thomas never see combat, but many of them do give their lives for their country. An interesting side note about Camp Thomas, One of the first Civil War reenactments ever took place on the grounds in September of '98. On the anniversary of the battle, soldiers dressed in their brown stable uniforms representing Confederates and soldiers in their blue wool uniforms representing, of course, the Union, stage an attack up Snodgrass Hill. And many of the colonels and older officers and older sergeants who were in the Army now had served there as young soldiers and said that it seemed quite odd to see men moving across the old battlefield once again. I'm sure, of course, it was far more entertaining to watch the second time through with blank ammunition. Now, this is not the only time that Chickamauga Battlefield will see other military usage. We hope you enjoyed our first video and what will become a series of stories about the items in our museum. We hope you'll join us next time for another episode of Past in Review with the History Company.